Hey, it's Dr. Assar Bear, and today we're going to be talking about inflation. All right, inflation is again one of our big three economic statistics, along with GDP and unemployment. These are, primary measures that we use to assess the economy. All right, so inflation represents a increase in the price level. And what we mean by price level is the average level of prices. All right, so in general, a percentage change in the price level, if it's an increase, that's inflation, and if it's a decrease, that is deflation. All right, so one of the facts of modern economic life is that inflation is a lot more common. Inflation is pretty much a common chronic condition of most modern economies. Deflation is relatively rare in the modern economy of the world. So what we see is that price stability, that is a situation where the price level does not change, is also very rare. All right, so one of the things that we need to do then is to explain this, right? If this is what we've defined inflation, so what is an explanation for? Okay, the oldest theory of inflation. Okay, we're going to put the heading here. Why is there inflation? The oldest theory of inflation is known as the quantity theory of money. Quantity theory of money. And it has a long history. Goes back to economists like Jean Bodin, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, and others, who basically argued that there's a relationship here between four variables. Okay, so quantity theory of money looks at an equation. This is called the equation of exchange. And the equation of exchange looks at four variables. Okay, these are M. So we've got M times V equals P times Q. All right, MV equals PQ. So M refers to the total money supply. All right, that is the total amount of money that is in circulation in the economy. Okay, in an economy. That is the money supply. And we're going to talk about this concept at some length later on when we talk about money, the history of money, monetary policy, banking, things of that nature. Right? V stands for the velocity of money. The velocity of money. Okay, so the velocity of money refers to the number of times it changes hands per time period, right? Money is typically spent, right? We don't want money in and of itself. We want money as a tool to purchase goods and services, right? So velocity of money reflects, well, how many times does that happen per time period, okay? Like per day or month or year or whatever it is, right? How many transactions are there, right? So the number of transactions per time period, okay? Let's say it's per year, right? Velocity of money, and that has, I think, a kind of straightforward appeal to it, right? Like money that has the more transactions per year, it's moving at a higher velocity, a higher speed, right? P refers to the price level. Okay, P refers to the price level. And Q refers to the total economic output of the economy. All right, now in modern language, we would refer to this as nominal GDP. All right, so we've got four economic variables here: MV, PQ, all right? The total money supply times the velocity of money equals the price level times the total economic output, okay? Now, this is set up as a mathematical identity, all right? So it's kind of like an accounting formula, right? It must be the case that the total money supply times its total velocity, it must be the case that this is equal to the average level of all prices times the amount of actual stuff that there is, okay? So, so where this becomes a theory of actual inflation is to make a couple of assumptions, all right? So to say, let's take a look at the short term, okay? In the short term, we have the quantity and the velocity of money are fixed, okay? They're fixed in the short term. So that is because the total economic output, the nominal GDP, this changes only relatively slowly, okay? So if we're talking about this year, the GDP is likely to be pretty similar, right? Even an economy that's growing very rapidly, 5% or even 10%, that's still close to the same as it was last year, right? So in the short term, say that's fixed, and the velocity of money is also fixed. The reasoning there is the velocity of money has a lot to do with, it's this speed of money, okay, the number of transactions per year. This is a product of the historical development of that economy, okay? How many transactions they make is kind of a matter of habit, of custom. That's not likely to change in the short term, right? People make about the number of transactions per day or whatever that they make. In the short term, that's not going to change, okay? So if we have these two variables that are fixed, right, the bar over it indicates that it's being held constant. If there is an increase in the money supply, there will be a consequent increase in the prices, okay, of roughly the same magnitude. So that makes this a theory of inflation. We can see, well, it's a pretty straightforward theory of inflation then, right? So if the total amount of money in the economy increases by, let's say, 5%, then we would expect the same 5% increase in the price level. All right? So very old theory of inflation, the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money came out of, if we look at the history in a little more detail, the Europe for most of the development of capitalism had very stable price level. Okay, stable price level. That is, we look at the 17th, 18th, even into the 19th century, we have prices that remain stable for 100 years, 150 years. Okay, inflation, when it occurs, is episodic, right? That is, there are episodes of price inflation. Okay, so the major example of this is the discovery of the New World, right? And this is an example that Adam Smith talks about in The Wealth of Nations. The discovery of the New World, the New World had gold and silver. So the very first thing that the European conquerors, the conquistadors and others, what they did was they grabbed the gold, they took slaves, and they brought the gold back to the European market, where, since this is the gold was the currency of the world, more or less at the time, right? The world is on the gold standard. There was a massive increase in the amount of new gold hitting the market. Okay, so that caused an episode of inflation during that period. All right, and according to Adam Smith, the amount of inflation during that period was somewhere on the order of 30 to 50%. Okay, so we have a very stable price level aside from certain of these episodes. But how many times in history are the Americas discovered by Europeans? Right? I should say discovered, right? Like, the people living there obviously knew about it, but you know what I'm saying, right? That happens one time in history, right? So this is what I mean by episodic, right? It's a particular episode, okay? Versus when we get into the modern era, the situation is very, very different. Okay, in the modern era, we have inflation is become chronic. That is, like I started off with this lecture, we expect to see inflation occurring, pretty much every year. Okay, and in fact, what we know is that on average, if we look at the last 100 or so years of U.S. history, right, last 100 years, the inflation rate on average is about 3%. All right, inflation rate's about 3%. If we look at inflation and the growth of prices, what we find is that inflation, is an exponential growth rate. Okay, so we can use our little rule of thumb, okay, our rule of 70, in order to understand this growth rate, like all growth rates, right? So that is, we're going to take the number 70 and we're going to divide by the growth rate. Okay, we're just going to drop the percentage symbol and we're going to divide by whatever the number is. Okay, so example, the growth rate is, let's say, 3%. We're going to take 70 divide by 3 and we get about 23 and a third, right? And what this means is this is the number of years that it takes for the price level to double, right? And again, this is a far cry from price stability, okay? If the price level is doubling every 23 years or so, that's pretty rapid, right? That's actually pretty rapid change in the price level. So by this measure, there's going to be a little more than 4 doublings in the course of 100 years, right? So again, we start at year 0, we go out, 23 years or so, we start at a price level, whatever cost $1, at year 0, now costs $2, right? We go to 46 years, now it costs $4, right? We go to 69 years. I know what you're thinking. Nice. 8 years, and so forth, right? By the time we've got less than 100 years later, $16, right? You see this chain here, right? 1 becomes 2, it doubles, becomes 4, doubles, becomes 8, doubles, becomes 16. Okay, so within 92 years, this is actually a pretty rapid rate of change in something. Okay, so an inflation rate like we've seen the historical inflation rate in the United States about 3%, that's not stable prices at all, right? That's actually fairly rapid change at the price level. So next thing we're going to look at is the calculation of inflation. Okay, so calculation of inflation. This is one of our modern economic statistics in the United States. It is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Right, so that's the entity that's responsible for gathering this data and analyzing it. This is monthly. The measure that's used, the most widely used measure of inflation, is called the Cpi-U, and this refers to the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers. Right, Consumer Price Index for urban consumers. This is what the U stands for, right? And like the BLS notes, this is holds for about 93% of the U.S. population. Okay, so by their measure, 93% of us are in the live under this kind of price regime or price changes, which they track in their index. Okay, so what the price index is, what it does is it tracks the total cost of a market basket of goods and services. All right, and the way that they do this is they they um, they conduct a survey on household expenditure. Okay, household expenditure survey, and it's a survey of about 7,000 households. Right, just asking them what is their spending. Okay, and because what they want is they want the goods and services that are in this market basket to be representative of the typical urban consumers. Okay, so uh, that's what the representative of the cost of living of the average urban consumer. All right. Okay, so here we are looking at the consumer price index for all urban consumers. That's a Cpi-U, like I mentioned. All right, and this is looking at it by expenditure category. Okay, so we're looking at now what is in this consumer price index. All right, and the last data that we have that this video is based on is February 2020. Okay, so this column, this first column, okay, the relative importance. This means the percentage of this item that's in the index. Okay, so all the items, of course, the percentage there is 100. All right, and then we can look at, well, what are the categories? What are the expenditure categories that are in this index? Okay, so we can see one of the items that they have is food. Right, so food is just under 14% here of the index. Okay, and we've got it broken down into different categories because the way that they're going to do this is they have to get very specific about what food items we're talking about. Right, here they've aggregated it, but they have many products. Right, this one is cereals and bakery products. But what they do in this category is they look at it precisely. Right, like a loaf of wheat bread with of this and this weight. Right, because they want it to be consistent throughout the index. That's what they're trying to track, the cost of this over time. Okay, so then we have energy is part of this. Okay, just under 7% of this, and we've got different categories of that. Right, we've got fuel oil, we've got motor fuel, mostly gasoline. We've got electricity, we've got natural gas, and so on. All right, so then we have commodities. Okay, so commodities, apparel, meaning clothing, vehicles, new vehicles, used vehicles, medical care, booze is in here, alcoholic beverages. It's not a huge component of this, right? It's 1%, a little over 1%, but it reflects that hey, people consume that. That's a thing that people buy. So if it changes in price, we want to know that, right? Tobacco and smoking products. I wonder what other smoking products they're talking about. I think tobacco is the main one, but I don't know. All right, then we have the biggest single aspect of this, which is shelter. Okay, this refers to rent, right? And they have two ways of gauging this. Okay, one of them is they track information about rents, and the other thing is that they track something here called the owner's equivalent rent of residences. Okay, what this refers to is people who own their own homes, right? There's lots of Americans own their own homes, right? So they don't really pay rent, but the BLS, the way that they view that is, well, if you're not paying rent, you still have an opportunity cost, right? Remember, the concept of opportunity cost is what you give up, the next best thing that you give up, right, by doing what you're doing. So if you own a house and you live in it, well, you're giving up the ability to charge somebody else rent, right? So in the household survey, what they do is they ask people, what do you think your home would rent for unfurnished? And they just, that's what. So this is where this category comes from. Okay, so between the two of these, we can see largest single item here in the consumer price index is shelter, or the meaning reflecting the cost of rent. Okay, so now again, the proportion in each of these things, right? Like I said, right, the commodities, 20%, energy, 6.6%, etc. Right, food,
these are meant to represent the average household's consumption. So if your particular household differs from that, then the consumer price index is going to be less representative, right? Because no number is really going to reflect accurately everyone's experience. Um, there's going to be differences. So, an average only goes so far, right? Like if we take something like average height or something like that, right? You might be above that or you might be below that, but that's still the average, okay? Um, all right, so uh, shelter, then we could look at, other services, medical care, for example, 7.2%, so on, transportation. All right, so these are the items, the kinds of items that are tracked in the index.
So let's do a simple example of how this looks. Okay, so an example of a price index. Okay, so we're going to start at a certain year, right? Let's say we start with last year, right, 2019. Okay, and we're gonna look at the prices of several different things in our index. Okay, so let's say we want to look at, I don't know, we've got like a burger, we got a T-shirt, and we've got a TV set. All right, it's our just to keep it simple, we got three items in our index. Okay, so let's say that we find that in 2019 the burger cost us $4, right? The T-shirt cost, let's say, $16, and a TV set cost $300. All right. So we would look at then what is the total cost of this. Okay, the total cost, and this is called the total cost on a market basket. Right. We're just going to add this all up, and we're going to get $320. All right. So now, what the BLS does is simply a more complicated version of this, right? They don't just use three commodities, they use goods and services. They have thousands of different items in here. Okay, so all we're doing is just getting a sense of how this works. Okay, so let's say then we track the exact same items from one year to the next, right? 2019 to 2020. Okay, and we might find that things change a little bit, right? Like let's say that the burger is now $4.50, the T-shirt is $15, and the TV set is $305. All right. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to total it up again, right, and see how this has changed. Okay, so when we do that, and we now get 324.50. Okay, so we're going to look at what's the percentage change in this. Okay, so percentage change in the total cost of our market basket. All right. And anytime we're doing percentage change, right, we're just going to take the new, subtract from it the old, divide by the old, multiply that by 100. All right. So our new one, 324.50. Our old one, 320. And we're going to divide by our old one. All right. And we're getting 4.5 divided by 320. This gives us 1.4%. Okay, so this would be our percentage change in the total cost of the market basket. All right, now just by convention, by tradition, the way that we make this a little more usable is we set it out. We say, okay, we're gonna create an index value. Okay, index value. And the index value is going to have a base. Okay, the base of an index is always 100. All right. So rather than saying, okay, this costs $320, we're going to just say, you know what, the index value of it was 100 in 2019. Then, if we can see what is the percentage change, right? So this is very easy when we start with 100. This is the reason why we start at 100, right? Because we can see quite clearly the percentage change here, we go from 100 to 101.4, right? Now, if we can't see that, if we're not starting with this, the easy way to see, like, well, how much has something, if something has increased by a certain percentage, what do you do there? Well, you take the number 1 and you add to that the percentage change, okay? So this one is 0.014, okay? So if we do that, and then we multiply it times the thing that has the percentage change, in this case 100, right? We're going to get 1.014 times 100, and that gives us 101.4. All right. Like I said, when we start with 100, it's easy. We don't need to go through all these steps. We probably just see how to do it. But if not, you just use this method, okay? So this is the creation of how price indices are created. Consumer price index is like this. Okay, they are tracking different items, specific items. They want them to be exactly the same, right? The burger hasn't changed. All that's changed about it is the price of it, not the kind of burger that it is or whatever. Not, it's not. We weren't starting off with a hamburger and now it's a cheeseburger or whatever. No, it's exactly the same in every respect. Okay, because we don't want to muddy the water, right? We only want to know what is the price change. We don't want it to be complicated. We don't want it to anything else to change. Okay, so with the CPI also has a base value. Okay, it has a base year of the index, and that year is 1982 to 1984. Okay, so the CPI for its base year is 100 at that point, right? So we can look at this, what the CPI is like. Let's say that right now the CPI is 245, right? So what this does is allows us to compare based on what it was in 1982, 1984, right? And we can see, okay, well, something that's gone from 100 to 245, what is the percentage change, right? Because the percentage change in the CPI, what is that? Well, that is the rate of inflation. Okay, the rate of inflation is the percentage change in the CPI. And again, the way we're doing it is we're just taking the new minus the old over the old. Okay, so in this example, 245 that's the new one, while 100 is the old one. So 245 minus 100 over 100. You see why we use 100, right? Because this makes it quite easy. We end up with 145 over 100, right? Times 100, to put it in percentage terms, we have 145%. Okay, so what the 145% refers to is the entire amount of the price, the change in the price level. Okay, so normally we express the rate of inflation as an annual figure. Okay, just for for convenience. All right, so when I say the average rate of inflation from over the last 100 years or so is about 3.1%, that means per year. Okay, that doesn't mean that whole time, right?
All right, let's take a look at some of the changes in inflation that have occurred over the last 100 years or so. Okay, we in the early part of the 20th century, we can see initially inflation rates very low, and then it becomes very high. We move into a period of deflation where prices fall for 2 years in a row here. We have a totally flat year. Prices fall again during the Great Depression. Okay, so prices fall pretty substantially for 3 solid years during the Depression. We have some flat year where it's 0.76%. So remember, when I'm looking at all this stuff, right, keep in mind, if 3.1% is about the 100-year average, right, anything that's below that is well below the trend, right? Anything that's above 3.1%, just use that as your kind of guide for thinking about these numbers, okay? So we get into the early 1940s, we have very strong inflation, okay, well above that 3%. We get almost 10% inflation. This is high by historical standards, okay? Inflation moderates and then shoots up again All right, so we get into it, we have a period in the 1950s and 60s where inflation is pretty low. Uh, but we start getting into the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and inflation rate starts to climb again. Um, all right, we find there is very high inflation in the early 70s here. Okay, so this is the highest inflation in the post World War II, right? This is after World War II. So the post World War II era uh, occurs here in the mid to late 70s. Okay, so starting in 1973 and continuing for several years here, okay, until the early 80s, at which time the begins to moderate. Okay, so we're still kind of above trend here, right, at 3.8%, but that's a far cry from the over 13% of 1979. All right, as we move into the 1990s, inflation moderates further still. Okay, so now we're seeing years, apart from a few outliers, right, where we're below 2% inflation, definitely below 3%, right? So again, this would be considered low inflation. Okay, anything that is below the trend, 2.5% certainly would be considered low inflation. Okay, so we go to the 1990s, then into the first decade of the 2000s, and inflation stays low except for right before the Great Recession begins in 2007, when the inflation rate is high. This is about the peak of the boom before the Great Recession begins. And when the Great Recession happens, okay, so in contrast to the recessions of the past here, especially the Great Depression, which involves very strong negative changes in the price level, deflation, the Great Recession involves basically none of that, right? So, in fact, still a very small amount of inflation, 0.09%. Um, there's only a few months where there's actual small amounts of deflation. Um, so basically, no price deflation occurs in 2008. And then we move into slight inflation, even though the Great Recession is is pretty bad in 2009, right? 2009 is pretty much the peak year in terms of unemployment. So we still have, like in terms of inflation, it looks like the economy has returned to normal, but that's not really the case, right? Because 2009 and 2010 are really in the grip of the Great Recession here. Great Recession, in my view, goes from 2008 to 2013. I think it's a 5 year long recession because that's the period where the unemployment rate stays high. All right, and then we continue on. We see uh, we have low rates of inflation in the aftermath of that. Okay, so since 2008, inflation has been very low. Okay, all right, that's a history.
All right, next let's consider the effects of inflation. Effects of inflation. Let's look at how inflation affects wages. Okay, so the effect of inflation on wages is pretty important because almost everybody in the economy, right, the vast majority of people in the economy earn most of their income through wages. Okay, so the question here is what is happening to your wages relative to the inflation rate? All right, that is, we need to distinguish between the real wage and the nominal wage. Okay, so real wage versus the nominal wage. All right, so it's a little bit hard to make sense of this because again, inflation is a chronic condition of the modern economy. It's happening pretty much every year, but it's happening to a small extent. Okay, so to understand the difference between the real wage and the nominal wage is only the dollar amount. Okay, nominal wage is the dollar amount. The real wage takes account of inflation to look at the buying power of the wage. Okay, the buying power, it adjusts it for changes in inflation. All right, so example. Okay, let's say that you have let's say your wage is equal to $10 per hour. Okay, so there's a couple of things that can happen here, right? Let's say that this is your nominal wage, right? $10 an hour, because you're always paid a nominal figure, right? You're paid a certain number of dollars per hour, right? If you get paid by the hour. So that's the nominal part, right? Now, where it becomes the real is we have to say, well, what is going on with inflation? Okay, let's say that inflation is equal to 2%. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Well, this means, by the way, this is considered a low inflation, right? What this means is something that costs $10 in 1 year, right? So let's say in 2019 is going to cost how much more? Well, we're going to take that 2%, okay, 2% is 0.02, and we're going to go 1 plus that, right, multiply it by the $10, okay? So when we do that, we get $10.20, okay? So if we have 2% inflation between 2019 and 2020, then that which costs $10 in 2019 cost $10.20 in 2020. Okay? So here's the thing, right? 2% inflation, the question is what is happening to your nominal wage, right? Well, there's different possibilities, right? So your nominal wage could, here's one thing that could happen, it could stay the same, right? So that $10, but here's the problem with that, right? For that $10 to stay stable in value, it would actually have to be $10.20, right? Because what used to cost $10 costs $10.20. That's what the inflation of 2% means, right? So if your nominal wage stays the same, what is happening is your real wage is actually going down, right? Your real wage is going down by 2%. So now another thing that could happen is your nominal wage could increase by, let's say, a small amount, okay? Let's say that you get a raise that takes you from $10 to $10.15, right? Now, you'd probably be happy about that, right? Because a raise is a raise, but should you be happy about it? I mean, are you actually better off in terms of your standard of living, in terms of the buying power of your wage? You are not, right? Because again, what needs to happen here is your wage needs to go to $10.20 just to stay even in real terms, okay? So if it goes to $10.15, that's not enough, right? $10.15 is a 1.5% increase, okay, or a 1.5% raise. But because inflation is 2%, if the raise is less than inflation, right, and you can see clearly, right, like 10.15 is less than where it needs to be. It needs to be at 10.20. Okay, so an increase a small amount, what is happening here? The real wage has decreased. But this is a very tough thing to perceive, right? Because the real wage has decreased, but in order to know that, you would have to be like following these inflation statistics, right? I mean, most people have better things to do, or they don't find it easy to keep track of the inflation statistics, or maybe they are, but they still are not getting a raise, right? For whatever combination of these reasons, this is a situation that the most workers have fallen into, right? That is, about 90% of workers in the United States in about the last 40 years or so have been in this situation. They've been in a situation where they may have gotten small raises, but these raises were slightly below the rate of inflation, and so the real wage fell, perhaps by a small amount, right? The real wage fell in this example by 0.5%. That's a pretty small amount, right? But what matters is that it's falling, okay? That's making you worse off. This worker is getting hurt. The real wage is falling, okay? And a final example, of course, is that it increases by a large enough amount that it brings you over that 1020 threshold, right? So example, let's say your wages go up to 1050. All right, now we're talking, right? Now we've gotten a raise. Okay, we want to know what the percentage of the raise is. We take the new one minus the old one, subtract by the old one. Take the new one minus the old one, divide by the old one. When we do that, we get 5%. Okay, so 5% raise, the inflation rate again is 2%. We can see 1050 versus 1020, right? You're better off. Okay, so in this situation, your real wage has gone up. All right. Now, this, again, most workers have been hurt by inflation for the last 40 or 50 years, okay? But some have seen increases in their real wage. And the sad thing is, this has only been for about the top 10% of workers, okay, of wage earners. This tends to be like the professional classes, right? Your doctors and lawyers and educated professionals, right? These people have done fine, right? They have seen real wage increases. Their standard of living has gone up because they have gotten raises which have been at least keeping pace with inflation. But, if I'm honest, right, the reason that that's true is largely because of the top 1%, and even more so, just the top 0.1%. That's where the bulk of the gains have gone to the very, very richest end of the income distribution. Okay, so there's lots of people in the top 10% who haven't really seen increases in their real wages, but it looks like it because if we aggregate them all together with the very rich, the very rich have done so much better than everybody else that it looks like they're going up. All right, so the effect on your life depends on what else is happening. That's the bottom line here. Okay, it depends on what's happening with the wage. The wage is not the only variable, though, of course, right? Because there's other ways that you can make an income, all right? So let's look at the effect on the interest rate. All right, inflation and the interest rate are moving in opposite directions, okay? So we have to distinguish here between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. Nominal interest rate versus nominal interest rate versus the real interest rate. Okay, so why do we have to distinguish this, right? Well, the reason is because the inflation rate subtracts from the nominal interest rate. Okay, so let's give an example. Okay, let's say that you borrow a sum of money. Okay, let's say it's $1,000 at an interest rate, we'll call that little I, equal to 5%. Okay, so you borrow $1,000 at an interest rate of 5%. Okay, let's just keep it simple. Okay, let's say that the term of the loan is 1 year. You got to pay it back 1 year later. Okay, so if this is the deal, then what you have to repay is 1 plus the interest rate, right? So 0.05. So you got to repay 1.05 times 1,000. Okay, you need to repay $1,050 in 1 year. All right. So the thing is, the nominal interest rate. This is the nominal interest rate right here. The inflation rate is subtracting from that. Okay, because let's say that there's some inflation going on, even if it's low, right? Let's say we'll stick with our 2% example, right? 2% inflation is low inflation. But even at that level, what's going to happen is it's going to eat into the interest rate, okay? So, because keep in mind what 2% inflation is. That means the buying power of $1,000, right? Like, how much money does it take to purchase what $1,000 could purchase right now, but next year? I know I said that in a confusing way, right? The buying power of $1,000 changes, right? If there's 2% inflation, it's going to take $1,020 to buy what $1,000 used to buy. So part of this gain, see this, right? If you're going to repay $1,050, but it's like in real terms, what did you actually pay, right? You paid less than that because, but part of it has gone towards inflation. Okay, so the bottom line here is any amount of inflation, however high it is, inflation lowers the nominal, I'm sorry, inflation lowers the real interest rate. Inflation lowers the real interest rate. So, in other words, what we're going to do here is we're going to take the nominal interest rate, subtract from that the rate of inflation. Okay, so in our example, we had a 5% nominal interest rate. We subtract the rate of inflation, we get a 3%, and this will be called the real interest rate. Right, the real interest rate. So the consequence of this is, borrowers can actually benefit from inflation as long as it's unforeseen. Okay, so bottom line, borrowers can benefit from inflation, and lenders can be hurt by inflation. Okay, so to understand this, we can show that the real interest rate can actually be negative. Okay, the real interest rate, real little I, can be negative. All right, now the way that money lending works is you're gonna have to pay back more later, right? You're always gonna have to pay back more later. You're never gonna have a negative nominal interest rate, right? So what I mean is, look, if you borrow $1,000, there's no way you're paying back less than $1,000, right? You're always going to pay more than $1,000. That's a positive nominal interest rate. But the real interest rate can be negative, okay? So let's say that this happens, right? You borrow the $1,000. The interest rate that you borrow it at is 5%. But let's say something totally unforeseen happens, okay? Let's say that the inflation rate increases way beyond what anybody expected, right? Nobody thought this would happen, but the inflation rate becomes 10%. Well, now you're repaying the debt in real terms with what money that is worth less, right? With money that is worth less. Because here's what's happening, right? You borrowed the $1,000, you have to repay an amount equal to $1,050, right? Just like we talked about before. You borrowed $1,000. You have to repay $1,050. But here's the problem, right? That the $1,050 is less than the $1,100 that it would take to buy the same amount of goods and services that cost $1,000 last year, okay? So the lender has been repaid less in real terms, okay, less in real value than they lent, okay? That is the lender getting hurt by inflation, all right? Now I know what you're thinking, right? Cry me a river, lenders, you guys have money. So the problem is that no lender will loan at a negative interest rate. They're never going to loan at a negative interest rate. As we get into the 1970s, this is a period of high inflation. Okay, high inflation, and lenders are having a real problem because the interest rates are much higher than what they thought they were going to be. Right? They're much higher. It's put some of them into a negative real interest rate, and that causes a problem for lenders. They don't want to continue to loan money and be repaid in real terms less than what they loaned, right? So this high rate of inflation causes a change in lending, right? A change in lending. And that change goes from fixed rates, fixed interest rates. Now, borrowing at a fixed interest rate is very, very old historically. I mean, lending money is thousands of years old. It's as old as recorded history. You know, some of the the oldest pieces of writing that we have are about debts, right? Thousands and thousands of years old. During that whole time, lending was at a fixed interest rate. Okay, so example, if you borrowed at an interest rate of 5%, it's going to stay at 5%, right? That's going to be the interest rate. Okay, so what was new, what happened in the 1970s that was new is new. The adjustable rate loan, the adjustable interest rate was born. Okay, so and the way this was created was with mortgages. Okay, so nowadays it's called an adjustable rate mortgage, an ARM. A mortgage, a house is like this, the single largest thing that the average person ever buys. So the mortgage is the largest, debt that a person ever takes on, typically. Okay, so in the 1970s we moved from the fixed rate mortgage to the adjustable rate mortgage. Okay, and this one doesn't have a fixed rate, right? The interest rate can change depending on a bunch of different factors, right? So usually it's tied to what's called the prime rate. Okay, so it's going to be tied to something which anchors it, right? But that thing moves around in response to the inflation rate and other variables. Okay, so the prime rate plus something. Okay, so the adjustable rate mortgage was devised as a way of protecting the lender from unforeseen inflation. Okay, so unforeseen inflation, right? Like because here's the thing, okay, if the inflation rate right now is 5%, the rate at which somebody is going to borrow is never going to be less than that, right? Because again, the lender is never going to voluntarily lend at a negative real interest rate. Okay, so the interest rate has got to be above 5% when the inflation rate is 5%. Okay, so the only problem for the lender is if the inflation rate is changes in a hurry, right? It's something that happens and they didn't see that coming. All right, so nowadays you can find mortgages. You have both options, right? You can get a fixed rate mortgage, or you can get an adjustable rate mortgage. But most consumer debt these days, especially the kind that's easy to get, most consumer debt, example, credit card debt. Credit card is the easiest way to get a loan, right? I mean, the problem with it is it's a very high interest rate, and that interest rate is adjustable, right? Your credit card rate, I mean, there are different deals out there, right? But the overwhelming majority of them, these are adjustable interest rates. Okay, so that is, they are designed, like all these things, to protect the lender from the risk of inflation. Okay, so next topic, let's talk about some of the problems or limitations of this consumer price index as a measure. Okay, so consumer price index was criticized. Okay, it's a famous set of criticisms that emerged in the 1990s, and the consumer price index was studied. Right, they had the Boskin Commission. Right, Boskin Commission, group of notable economists and political figures who were appointed to study the consumer price index and try to suggest some improvements. Okay, so we're going to study and suggest changes. All right. So now, why was this necessary? Well, a lot of economists had pointed out that the consumer price index has certain problems associated with it. Okay, so we have well-known problems, right? One of these difficulties is the effect of changes in quality. All right. So changes in quality distort the CPI. All right. Now, all these things that distort the CPI cause a certain problem. Okay, they cause the inflation rate to either overstate or understate the true amount of inflation. Okay, so let's give an example. Okay, so let's say that this happens. Okay, let's take an example that has to do with tires. All right, tires have one simple job, right? They're like, okay, they last a certain amount of time on your car, certain number of miles, right? That's what they do, right? So it's very, very clear to assess like how long do they last, right? Let's say that a set of tires lasts like, I don't know, 10,000 miles, okay? And these tires cost $100, all right? So, and let's say that this is in like, I don't know, 1980 or something, all right? Now, let's say that things change, right? Yeah, so by the year 2000, okay, let's say they figured out how to make tires better. They figured out how to put little threads of steel in there, and they figured out better mixes for the rubber, and how to make better layers, or have 3D printing that who knows, right? They figured out better ways of making tires. Okay, so the tires, let's say they now last 20,000 miles. Okay, and they cost $175. Okay, so here's the problem with this, right? The problem is if the tires are in the CPI, what has happened here in terms of the change in the price, right? Or the change in the price, okay, the percentage change in the price of these tires, we're going to take the new minus the old, divide by the old, right? It's easy because they start off at 100, okay? So 175 minus 100 over 100. What's happened here is the price has increased by 75%, right? But the tires are better than they were before, right? The tires are better. Look at this. They last twice as long. So you have to buy the tires like half as often as you had to before. You know what I'm saying, right? Like if you drove 10,000 miles a year, it costs you every year. It costs you $100 to get the tires that you needed for that, right? But now it's only costing you half of 175 because you only have to do this every 2 years now, right? So, but they last twice as long, right? They last twice as long. So what's really happened is the price has actually gone down, right? The per mile cost has decreased, right? It's 175 divided by 287.50, right? So the per mile cost of the tire has declined. All right, so that's one issue, okay? So this is a well-known problem, okay? Quality bias, quality changes. Now, this is the happy case, right, where the quality has gone up. Okay, there's some goods for which that's true, right? They're better goods than they were before. If the quality's gone down, that's the opposite issue, right? So tires, tires really are better than they used to be, right? People used to get much more flat tires. Tires would wear out faster. Um, let's take something like clothing, right? Let's take something like t-shirts. Um, so the t-shirt doesn't last as long, right? How long does a t-shirt last, right? Let's say a t-shirt that lasts like 3 years, right? How long it lasts. Okay, let's say lasts 3 years and costs $18. All right. Well, let's say that the t-shirt does this, okay? It has a decline in quality, okay? Now it only lasts 2 years, but it's also become a little bit cheaper, right? Let's say that it lasts 2 years, but now it costs $15, right? So, again, in terms of the price change here, okay, the percentage change in the price of the t-shirt, okay, the new minus the old over the old, this is a decrease, right? It has gone down to $3, okay? Its old price was 18, so this has declined in price by negative 16.67%, all right? So that would look like a falling price, but that's not really what's happening here, right? Because again, you're going to have to buy this last 3 years. So if we looked at it on a per year basis, right? Like on a per year basis, this is like 9, right? Because this is like $6. On a per year basis is like $6 versus this one taken divided by the number of years, this is like 750. Okay, so if we look at it relative to its quality, this is actually a price increase. Okay, you see the problem right here? This is a distortion. These are things that distort the CPI. Okay, now we have to study, well, have there been more quality increases or quality decreases? Is it more like tires or more like t-shirts, right? Okay, so second problem with the CPI is called substitution bias. Substitution bias, all right? And this is something that economists have been saying for a long time. The Boston Commission, echoed this, which is they said, look, we know from the law of demand, right, going back to Alfred Marshall, we know from the law of demand that consumers make substitutes, right? As prices go up, consumers avoid the price increase. They buy other things, right? They don't buy the exact same mix of products. They try to avoid the price increase and get something else, right? So the example that the Boston Commission used to try to explain substitution bias is they said, okay, if the price of steak increases, then the consumers, some consumers at least, right, some consumers are going to buy hamburger instead, okay? So now why is this a problem, right? Well, because they were saying this is like an inferior product or an inferior type of meat, right? An inferior cut of meat. So to have an increase in the price, which then led to a shifting of demand away from that product, this left the consumer worse off. Okay? The Boston Commission saw this as a major problem. They said what the CPI should be trying to do is it should be trying to keep the consumer, their overall level of well-being or happiness should be constant. Okay? So we started to see a kind of disagreement happening between economists. Like the CPI, is it trying to measure the cost of living, or is it trying to measure the consumer's well-being? So the economists that were in the Boston Commission, their position was we're trying to measure the consumer's well-being. And so if the consumer buys an inferior product, the consumer is worse off, and that's bad, right? We want to actually measure that because the consumer price index is not currently measuring that, right? All it would be tracking is the increase in the price of steak, not any other purchasing, right? In other words, it wouldn't be tracking any substitution bias at all, right? So that was their complaint. That was the substance of the critique. Is we have a quality bias and we have a substitution bias. All right, we have another problem. Okay, the third problem is what if there is new products, right? New goods or services that become widespread that people actually like. Okay, so a lot of examples in terms of electronics, right? New kinds of products that are very widespread that people like. All right, so this is very similar to the quality change issue, but now think of products that do totally different things, right? It's not just like tires that last longer or t-shirts that don't last as long or whatever it is, right? It's stuff that does totally different things than it used to do, okay? There's new goods or services, or there are new features of existing goods and services. Okay, let's take a classic example, the example of the TV set. Okay, so let's compare a TV set from a couple of different eras, right? Let's compare the TV set of 1955 to the TV set of like 1980 to the TV set of like today, right? 2020. Well, the TV set in 1955 was like this huge box, right? It was black and white only, right? Um, the so the TV set in 1980 had a whole bunch of new features, right? That's the thing that's going on here. You had the remote control. Wow, what did that amazing new thing, right? You had color instead of black and white. Fantastic. Um, this is a different product, right? Even though it does basically the same thing, right? They're both TV sets. This one is a better product, right? It has new features which make the consumer happier, right? They make the consumer better off, right? Then we go to today, my God, right? Now we have this. We got the TV is no longer this huge box. It's very thin. You hang it on your wall or whatever, right? It's plasma or whatever the hell it is, LCD. I don't know, right? And it has many, many more features than the TVs in the past, right? I mean, the you can watch two channels at once. You can do all kinds of things with these TV, right? It goes on and on, right? I'm just going to add a bunch of plus signs, okay? In terms of these TV sets have a much more features than in the past, okay? So again, we're going back and forth between this debate over what should the CPI be tracking. Should it be tracking changes in the cost of living, or should it be tracking changes in the consumer well-being, okay? So here's the issue, okay? If the TV set in 1955 cost $100 and the TV set in 1980 costs $200, but it has very different features, here's the question, right? How much are the new features worth, right? Because in principle, the change in the price here is $100, but part of that price change is due to inflation, and part of it is due to these new features, right? And the same thing, right? This thinner plasma TV, fancy, blah blah, all this stuff, right? What is that worth to the consumer, right? This TV set now costs, I don't know, let's say it costs $300, right? So that's an increase, but maybe in real terms it's a decrease. Like, well, maybe it increased $100, but it has $200 of new and better features or something, right? So because the Boston Commission and many economists started to overwhelmingly focus on the consumer's well-being, and they wanted the CPI to reflect changes in the consumer's well-being, they tried to put a dollar figure on this. Okay, they used a new thing in economic theory, which is called hedonic pricing. Okay, hedonic pricing means that they are going to answer this question of how much are the new features worth. Okay, so let's say we go from 1955 to 1980, we have new features, and we say, well, the new features are worth $70, right? We try to answer that. That's what hedonic pricing is. It means we're going to impute a value, okay? And so we would say the new price, we would subtract that $70 out, right? We'd say the new price is only $130, the $200 actual price minus the effect of those new features, the $70. Okay, that's my presentation on inflation. Thank you very much.